Janssen also figures prominently in my book, at least as a source. Kausbrook wrote, "What did the Japanese think, and what did the sophisticated Japanese think of us? How did they think about themselves? No one looked into this. They are traditionally assumed to be black boxes without internal processes. Why did they behave as they did? For no reason, out of cruelty and badness, nothing more. The wartime Japanese as black boxes who acted simply out of malice and malevolence, trickery and deceit, at best, perhaps self-deceit. And a lack of interest in digging much further into this on our part. A simple black and white story that Kausbrook attributes to wartime and post-war Dutch perspectives, particularly those Dutch who had the misfortune of living in the Netherlands Indies during the Japanese occupation. But it is also not a bad summation of how the wartime Japanese have generally been characterized across national borders, not only in the Netherlands, but also in the West more generally, and also, in fact, outside the West as well, including in Indonesia, where the wartime story has long been almost always framed in national terms, the bad Japanese versus the good Indonesians. And yes, even in Japan itself, where the narratives of the war seem also to divide largely into two versions of black and white. A black version favored by Japanese progressives who represent the majority of mainstream scholars, thank God, still, and a white version favored by a smaller but very outspoken group of Japanese right-wing revisionists. I don't have the time to go into my own historical background that drove me to take on this project beginning more than 25 years ago now, in the early 90s as a graduate student in modern Japanese history at Columbia University. But one of the most important intellectual settings of this research was a growing atmosphere of scholarly skepticism regarding such simplistic narratives about the Japanese. Among other things, this skepticism grew out of the more general critique of Orientalism, launched by Edward Said and others from around the late 1970s. What if these simplistic assumptions about the Japanese were not accurate, and indeed could be shown to be themselves largely a product of Western colonialism and Eurocentric propaganda and understandings of World War II? In sum, how might we reconceive Japan's war and its impacts if we begin from the assumption that modern Japan in the 1930s and 40s was indeed modern, and that its aggressive actions could not therefore be explained, or rather explained away, by such culturalist interpretations? Secondly, how might we pursue this in a balanced way that did not fall into the trap of simply reversing the perspective by overemphasizing the Japanese side of the story alone? In other words, in order to get beyond both Eurocentric and Japanese imperial understandings of this history, was it not also necessary to give an equal, if not a greater voice to the colonized as well as the colonizer? In this aim, I found it imperative to immerse myself in the Indonesian language and in Indonesian history before undertaking the research. But here there arose yet another challenge. As I noted just now, conventional Indonesian accounts of the war experience, it turned out, were in many ways, often in their own way, just as black and white with regard to the wartime interaction with the Japanese. This is entirely understandable if we think of the immense, undeniable cruelty and suffering that Japan brought to Indonesia. Shortly after the war, Indonesian casualties in Java alone were estimated at around 3 million. But, was there more to this story than just black and white? As I began and continued my research, I began to have doubts about this black and white. For one thing, it soon became clear to me that Japanese wartime propaganda was quite sophisticated, modern, and indeed radical in its self-justification. It contained remarkably powerful critiques of colonialism, as well as capitalism, albeit, of course, always with the important qualification that the problem was Western colonialism and Western capitalism. Secondly, it also became clear that despite all the obvious contradictions within this ideology and between ideology and practice, many Japanese really believed this propaganda of Asian brotherhood as a solution to the modern problems supposedly introduced into Asia by the West. Maybe they were introduced into Asia by the West, but that supposedly applies to what happened after that. And the idea that it was still, basically, these were still Western and not global problems. Indeed, over time, as Japanese failures and problems mounted, many of the Japanese in occupied Indonesia also seem to have felt betrayed by the failure of their fellow Japanese to live up to these promises. Thirdly, it seemed to me that many Japanese actually had a kind of love affair with Indonesia, as a place where they might finally realize their plans for a greater Asia in ways that they had been frustrated before. This is, of course, I'm reflecting the Japanese perspective at the time. Fourth, on the Indonesian side, too, the more I became aware of the radicalism of Japanese wartime propaganda, the more I started to question standard Indonesian accounts of immediate recognition of the Japanese simply as schemers or phonies or fascists. For one thing, things already get more interesting when we realize that the Dutch were among the most unpopular of all the Western colonizers in Asia, and that the Japanese were, in contrast, an unknown quantity to most Indonesians. To put it simply, it seemed to me that the Japanese as liberators, in quotation marks, actually had a lot going for them in terms of hopes for success as occupiers among both colonizer and colonized, more than in almost any other colonial occupation I can think of before or since. And to put it again very simply, the more I started looking, particularly at wartime documents that were not affected by what we might call the 2020 hindsight of the late war and the post-war, the more I found. This is in sum where my book comes from. I don't have time to cover where it goes here, but I hope this is enough to give you a taste of it, at least the basis of it. And maybe we can talk more about that now. Thanks.